Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. For those of you on the live call, thank you. I know I heard from a lot of people who are interested in this topic and not able to make the live call as well. So if you're watching the playback, thank you for your interest. It's great to see such a good response to this event. Um, my name is Megan Theode. If you don't know me, I am the creator of this series, the Medicine Weaver mini series it started back in, let's see, March. We did our first one, and now this is part 3. And we have my dear friend and colleague Joseph McCaffrey has offered to join us for this event. I'll say a little bit more about Joseph and let him introduce himself in a few moments here. But just to tell you, sort of bring everyone up to speed, I know some of you have seen the first 2. We started this series with the topic of awakening your medicine gifts, and then moved into trusting your intuition. And which both of those are available on the website if you haven't seen them and would like to catch up. And the idea with the series is been this building on the topic of bringing your medicine into the world and what that journey might look like, what some of the main themes might be. And today our topic is transforming your trauma. And one of the reasons that I felt this was so important on a personal level, I know it's been a really big part of my journey and continues to be part of my journey of bringing my own medicine into the world. And it just seems to be such a common thing that I witness in clients who I'm supporting with this same task too, is that at some point, it's like the desire to move towards your medicine, to move more towards your authentic self, to expressing the truth, the bigger truth of who you are, allow spirit move through. At some point, it seems like something kind of shows itself as what's in the way, the thing that gets in the way. Or maybe there are multiple things that get in the way, but it might sort of all come back to a similar pattern. It could look something like stage fright, or really having a gift for speaking and sharing wisdom, and then when we get on stage, all of a sudden it's just like clamped down, or showing up for a healing and not being able to show up in the way that you want to. It could show up more as sort of ways of being distracted from what you know you're here to do. Maybe there's certain relationship dynamics or patterns at work that drain your energy, and or other forms of sort of self-sabotage, or who knows what there are so many ways that it can show up, the thing that gets in the way. And so what tends to be underneath that, what I've found for myself, and I think Joseph can share a lot more about, is that a lot of times these sort of the thing that gets in the way is often rooted in some sort of trauma in the past. And so we're going to look at the role that trauma might be playing in limiting or inhibiting or impacting your capacity to bring your true self into the world, and explore what the landscape of trauma looks like in general, what it might look like, and how you might go about transforming your trauma and transforming your relationship to chronic fear patterns or events from the past, that in a way that might open more space for bringing your medicine forward. So that's the idea for today. And just to share a little bit with you about Joseph. Joseph and I met, I was trying to do the math this morning, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
His wife, Zoe, and I were friends first in a women's circle in Prescott, where we all have lived together at various times. They've lived there the whole time I've come and gone. But when I remember when Joseph and I met, it was like there was just some sort of, at least for me, knowing that we had this like really strong connection of similarity in the work that we do. And it's felt very complementary. I think that at least for me, Joseph has been a sounding board over the years as I've been developing my own capacity as a soul guide, I think, as a general term. And And at the time when we first met, he was studying at Prescott College in counseling psychology and ecotherapy, also studying with the Animas Valley Institute, which is a nature-based sort of, I don't even know exactly, maybe Joseph, you can say more how to describe it, but it's very much about personal development and bringing the cultivating wholeness, sort of what we're talking about today, cultivating a healthy ego to bring more of the soulful self into the world. A lot of the work at Animas is rooted in that vision quest and nature connection as a support for that. So there was a lot of overlap there between his background and my background in shamanic practice. Seemed like even though it was different language, there was so much commonality. And yeah, since then, I think, Joseph, you've been on quite a journey of coming into your gifts as a therapist and starting to focus more in trauma and complex developmental trauma. And I should probably, maybe I'll let you say a little bit more if you want to. I would love if you just share, maybe introduce yourself and just share how you found yourself in this area of helping people transform their trauma and as a therapist.
Sure. Well, thanks, Megan. I'm excited to be here today, and I'm also reflecting on our our journey together in the work that we've been doing and the conversations that we have had. And I'm glad to be here today to start to, be a part of this collaboration and this conversation. So I'll just say a little bit. It's a big story, as we all have, about our journey and transformation. I think for me, it started, I was a middle school teacher in Boulder, Colorado, and started to get involved with an organization called PassageWorks, and was bringing social emotional curriculum through the lens of rites of passage into the classroom. And when I began to read about or understand more around this idea of rites of passage and vision fast and that framework of severance, ordeal, and reincorporation, it was like something, like a deep longing struck me of something I had really wanted. And I had the sense at that time that something was off in our society and in our culture around the way that people in positions of leadership were acting and behaving, which actually felt, in a lot of ways, to me, people often laugh when I say this, very similar to what was happening in the middle school classroom. And coming to find that rites of passage has been lost from our culture, and how that rites of passage has supported that kind of transition from, well, I think for many cultures, from childhood into adulthood, and now recently through this passage of adolescence into adulthood within our culture. And so I got really curious about what it would be for myself to be a healthy, whole adult, and potentially maybe even someday an elder that really serves the greater world and our society. And that eventually landed me at Animas Valley Institute, to start training. And I did my first, what we call Vision Fast, about 10 years ago now, and got pretty steeped in this idea of eco-psychology. And Bill Plotkin, who started the organization, is rooted in depth psychology and eco-psychology. And so working with these different archetypal aspects of myself and how we frame it there, this mytho-poetic journey, coming to understand my own unique and particular soul place in the world, and spent many years in this work. And I think it was probably about 7 years in, and maybe even around the beginning of the pandemic and through the pandemic. It was a little before the pandemic, I think, where I had dove into this work so deeply, and yet I was finding myself coming up still against ways in which challenges within myself and within my relationships and within my work. And I had a sense that something was off. And as trauma has kind of been a big topic in our society, started to explore, well, maybe it has something to do with trauma and in my life. And then over the last year have really dived into the Narma Institute, which is based off complex developmental trauma and the neuroaffective relational model, and start to really understand through that lens of attachment trauma these different patterns within me, and starting to see more clearly what was really getting in the way of what I was really wanting for myself. And it just started to click and make sense. And it just has become such a real passion of mine. And I think one reason, because of teaching and the work in the natural world in my childhood of living in a rural place and having a connection to the natural world, all these things interconnecting, but also with my educational trauma that I experienced and how that impacted me has just really led to a real passion around supporting others with their own complex developmental trauma, and how it's really showing up within them and how those patterns are getting in the way of what they're really wanting for themselves.
Great. Thanks.
So that's the that's the short of it.
Yeah, that's a good intro. And we'll
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you some more questions about your journey too in a little bit
Okay.
here. But I'm wondering if we could just sort of start out with a maybe definition or your own perspective on what is trauma. You know, you just referenced complex developmental trauma.
Yeah.
Just kind of laying the framework for that.
Well, and this was a big piece for me actually in coming into seeking more training around trauma. And what I have come to understand is there's a difference between shock trauma and complex developmental trauma. And shock trauma is in a single event, of a life-threatening event that creates a stimuli that comes into us and causes those patterns that we'll see, outlined in like PTSD, where people are, have those kind of three categories. They start to re-experience that event. They get into avoidance strategies, and they're always kind of experiencing a sense of threat. But with complex developmental trauma, it often happens in earlier developmental stages. So the stimuli coming in would be the misattunement or the environmental failure that we might experience as a child. And then, so now we have to import in with that stimuli the developing self. And often the way we respond to this misattunement or the environmental failure around us is through shame. And complex developmental trauma, because, take one step back, we're wired to attach, attachment theory, that we're wired to attach to a primary caregiver. It's what keeps us alive in the world. And so if there's environmental failure, if that attachment is compromised in some way, then what we end up doing is unconsciously we shame ourselves, or we make it bad about ourselves as a way to protect that relationship with the attachment figure, because we have to. That's our universe, and if the universe is bad, then it's too dangerous for us. And so these patterns start coming out of that, and a lot around typically like a negative self-image, a challenge in regulating our own emotions, and difficulty in our interpersonal relationships.
Yeah. So am I interrupting you?
No, that could be a place to start. I mean, there's a lot more. It's very complex, but that's a way to start to begin to talk about it.
Yeah. So it's like, I'm just thinking about examples here. Like a shock trauma might be a near-death accident, for example, or a single violent event, or something of that sort, where that's sort of maybe like classic PTSD, where you're
Yes.
really reliving that experience over and over and can't quite resolve it.
Hmm.
And then complex developmental trauma is more like a repeated, like an example of like repeated criticism, perhaps, from a primary caregiver as a child might have, or repeated other forms of maybe emotional abuse, neglect, those sorts of
Hmm.
things, having addiction in the home, those kind of things can lead to
Hmm.
more complex developmental trauma.
Hmm. Yes, because in those experiences we have in a child, we start to relate to and organize our internal experience through that attachment relationship. So if, for example, if we have a need and we begin to protest when that need is not being met through anger, and say maybe anger within our family system is shut down or not accessible or not acceptable, right? Then first we have a need that's not being met, and now we are using the capacity we have at that developmental stage to protest to try to get that need met. And then that way of being is not accepted within our family. That can become very confusing for us. So how do we start to relate and organize our experience around that? Often is through this idea of shame and disconnecting from our authenticity. So what's interesting, right, is if my attachment relationship to my caregiver at an early age is literally life or death for me, then that's how I'm experiencing that misattunement or that environmental failure on some kind of level within my system. And so if it then becomes dangerous in some way or risky to express myself authentically, or then I cut myself off, a strategy, maybe I disconnect from my physical or emotional self, I compromise my own needs. I try to take care of everyone else's needs in my family so I can get my own needs met. I compromise any expression of my authenticity. I get confused about self-referencing what's authentic for me and what's not. Then those patterns unconsciously can then play out later in life. And so, for example, as I became closer to this kind of soul image of my place in the world and wanting to begin to embody that, I was coming up against really a lot of fear and really self-sabotaging and not really understanding why. But if there's been these unconscious patterns in me of of every time I got close to expressing my authentic self as a child and it was dangerous, then that is held with both within my body, my nervous system, and within my psyche and in my neurological patterning. Like these are long-term psychobiological patterning that come within us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that self-shaming, the difficulty in my relationships, um, a lot of inner critic, a lot of self-negative viewpoint of myself because I was a dyslexic learner. I'm not smart. I don't have the capacity. A lot of that kind of narrative was really rooted in my way of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate that distinction of like how as a child it is actually survival. It is almost like a near death encounter or a situation of chronically being exposed to this fear of not surviving um, if you don't show up in kind of like the right way or the accommodating way for things to stay harmonious or safe.
Mhm.
And so what I'm imagining now as you're saying that is like when it comes up in adulthood, something like being authentic rather than people pleasing. like
Mhm.
like in
Yeah.
childhood, maybe people pleasing was this strategy to stay safe that really
Yeah.
was life or death, or
Yeah.
at a very early stage.
Yeah.
Um, and then now breaking that pattern in some way and just like honestly speaking the truth could actually feel like life or death. Even like to
Yes.
the rational mind, it makes
Yeah.
no sense as an adult.
Right.
Like, why am
Yeah.
I so scared?
Exactly.
But the nervous system is still programmed or some way connected to that chronic pattern
Hmm.
from the past, and it like activating an experience of life and death that
Exactly.
isn't really rooted in here and now.
Hmm. Yeah, it's not like lining up with the narrative around you that we're seeing from a sense of our adult consciousness, but we're identifying with this kind of experience through the lens of our child consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And not one is good or bad. And that strategy, and often we explore a lot through the NARM model is, what has been right about that strategy? How did that strategy serve? And starting to shift our relationship with that strategy and have potentially more agency and more choice from our adult consciousness as a way to choose something different. And then if there's times that things are really overwhelming and things are difficult, we have that strategy in our back pocket and we can pull it out. But we have agency within when we use an awareness of when we're using and when we're not using that strategy.
Right. So there's more like choice and space rather than it being the only option or the default mode.
Yeah.
There's more, I think of it as like neuroplasticity, just
Mm.
because uh, I work in that world right now quite a
Yeah.
lot. But it's like um, maybe there's two paths in the brain. There's the old survival strategy, and then there's like you refer to adult consciousness or another way of navigating the situation. And there's at least a choice point there. But
Hmm.
maybe it wasn't. Is that kind of like what agency is?
Yeah, one of the ways I think about it is many of you may have heard a recent, I think it was in the last few months, an interview with Michael Pollan and talking about psychedelics and how we, within the thinking about this kind of analogy within the brain is when we have these deep psychobiological patterns, it's like if you think about skiing or snowboarding and you keep going down the same track, it gets deeper and deeper in the snow. I often say it becomes like a super highway. And so now there's this pattern of people pleasing as a way to keep ourselves safe or gain a sense of belonging or protect that relationship. Because on this unconscious level, we're afraid we might lose that relationship. So here's this pattern, right? And as we start to relate to ourselves differently from our adult consciousness and have some agency, then we start to make a self, maybe even start to self-reference what's authentic, start to embody that or communicate that, and recognize that we have as an adult like a deeper capacity to navigate the response of others, then we are laying down a new kind of a new track in the snow, a new pattern. And so it's small in the beginning, and then over time it begins to grow into one of those super highways, and we have potentially another pathway within ourselves and another pathway within our existence on the planet and the way we might be with ourselves and be with our work or be with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that analogy. Um, I'm curious. So I think you're starting to answer this question with one of the things I'm hearing is like, if someone wants to, is aware that there's a trauma pattern in their life, and they want to create more agency
Hmm.
or want to shift, maybe we just say transform that relationship, transform their relationship to their trauma. How it sounds like the first thing I'm hearing you say is just becoming aware of the familiar pattern,
Hmm.
starting to see it, or at least that's one piece, and then getting into this point where maybe there's more distance to choose something else. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you facilitate that process, or how do you
Yeah.
set up the conditions for that change to happen?
Well, I think you named a big piece of it right there. It really is within the NAR model. It is starting to create the conditions for agency for us to access our higher order thinking. And um, what I love about the NAR model is it's top down and bottom up. That there is a cognitive piece of starting to have awareness and understanding of these patterns. And I also think that there's an aspect of the psyche and the different parts of us and how they're in conflict with each other and needing to work with those pieces as well. But then there's also the nervous system and our body in the way that is in relationship to these patterning. So with NARM, we also work from the bottom up. So for example, if I'm a client and I start to disidentify with a strategy of for me it was really similar into pleasing others. It was a lot around kind of conforming and following the rules and and kind of behaving myself in a certain way. If I start to disidentify with those strategies and start to cognitively come into a different way of relating to myself or organizing myself from my adult consciousness, like recognizing that even if I show up to the fullest ability and authentically, and a rule is broken or someone doesn't like it, I have the capacity within me to navigate that situation, which I did not as a child. We just don't have that capacity. As I start to disidentify and move now into this other state of being, that's where we slow down and start really working with the body to start to really experience what's coming through within us. And I think there's a lot around this, but often when we start to create a sense of essentially structure within us and start to come into our anger in a way that it is has been maybe repressed as a child for very good reasons, and we start to understand the need of that anger and communicate that from a structured place and experience the explicit need, which is that protest we had as a child probably being manifesting in the present. There's a life force energy in that. This is complex, so I'm kind of giving you the short answer, but the sense is there's like an energy that starts to move through our body. And so even in resistance, like to treatment, there's energy in that. And when we can start to relate to that from or experience that from our adult consciousness or more structure within us, there's a flow, there's an aliveness. We start to connect with our hearts. We start to connect with our bodies more, ourself, our authenticity, and it flows through us. So we slow down and we really start to create space to connect with and feel and allow that experience within us to start integrating into our system. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm hearing in what you're saying, it's like, say there's the child consciousness and the strategy that someone may have, or strategies that may have been adapted in childhood to address a certain set of circumstances. And then there's an adult consciousness, which is much more rooted in authenticity and wholeness, and probably what we're talking about with this idea of like being in your medicine and being in your power and
Exactly.
expressing the truth of who you are. That it's not maybe necessarily so simple as just being like, well, I'm in my child consciousness, now I'm going to shift into my adult consciousness. That there's
Right.
sort of like I'm thinking of it as a portal
Yeah.
of like coming into contact with the unmet need that activated the fear patterns and the habitual response in childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow like coming into relationship to that. And I hear, well, in what you said, it's like coming into contact with possibly anger. I'm curious if there's other emotions that might live there.
Mm-hmm.
Is it for everyone? Is it anger? Is there often anger in most clients you see, or are there other things that might be there in
Mm.
that place of an unmet need?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
am I capturing the essence of it? Am I am I oversimplifying it?
Well, here's what I would say, and it does get a little tricky because I think what we're starting to talk about here is this idea, which we talk about in NARM, of primary emotions and default emotions. And which is a whole complex topic. But the way I'm understanding, starting to understand the primary emotion, and often the two emotions I do see come up a lot are anger and sadness. And so if we have like a primary, if we have a deep, authentic emotion as a child, like I can give example for myself of anger, and I'm protesting that a need is not being met within me. And I start to shut down that anger because it would be actually too dangerous for me to express, which it was in a Catholic school where there was corporal punishment and those different pieces. That was dangerous for me to express. So I shut that down. So here in the present, one of the way I started to relate to my anger, and for many different reasons, that it was dangerous to express. And and here's where it got really tricky for me. I'll try to answer your question. Is through the work I was doing at Animas Valley Institute, and this is, and I'm not saying this is how they do it, but this is how I was relating to it, was this idea of like you get into your wholeness, you access these kind of whole archetypes or the adult version of these archetypes within you, and then that's how you, once you're in your wholeness, you can start to experience emotions and the world from our wholeness and our relationships, and we're in that adult place. But how I was using that was I was using that I need to get in my wholeness to be a good boy and not express my anger. So like if I'm in my wholeness, then I won't be angry at people. It was kind of this belief or idea that I began to create around my relationship with anger. But as I started to structuralize myself and then actually come into my anger, my primary emotion, and really understand like the explicit need of it, which was, I want to be treated like with dignity. The emotions that came up around that were one, the sadness, the grief, one of not getting that as a young person, as a child. And then, but through the anger is what brought me into my wholeness. So it flipped it for me. It wasn't about me going, like you're saying, okay, I'm in my child consciousness. I'm going to go get into my wholeness and my adult consciousness and experience my anger. It was coming through my anger is actually then what allowed me to connect to my heart and my wholeness that way. So it's complex. I mean, it's tricky. And it takes time. This relational models, they take time to come into that connection with oneself. And each person has um, their own pacing. And it's in the respecting of that pacing is where we are starting to create the conditions that we didn't get as a child. We start to attune to the pacing of the person in front of me and where they're at, so that those are the conditions that begin to create that it starts to feel safe to connect with our capacity to actually create the safety within ourselves to connect to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And got a two thoughts there. One is just curious about that notion of like creating safety within yourself. Like, what is that a prerequisite to that process of really going into the anger, or is that a byproduct, or neither? Like, where does creating safety within yourself fall into this?
Yeah. Well, and the truth is, the needs we had as a child to have someone create safety for us, um, to have these, the needs that we have as a child are long gone. They are, and now this is tricky because the truth is we do live in a society that isn't safe in a lot of ways, and as an adult, um, there's an opportunity to start to connect with the capacity now that we have now that we don't have as a child to start to essentially meet those own needs within ourselves and start to create the the container within ourselves for that kind of safety or feeling grounded or feeling at peace or feeling whatever it may be for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the way I have come to understand it is yes, like once we start to, the terminology we often use in Narma is structuralizing or, or, or start to connect with our agency, that then does start to build the container to experience our anger in a way that we're not overwhelmed as when we were a young person. Because
Mhm.
if there's that misattunement as a young person and we're experiencing this anger and we're not being met or supported, that can become it's overwhelming for a child. You don't have the capacity to, as a child, to manage and navigate all those emotions. And that's where that dysregulation comes from. And the challenge to regulate comes from with complex developmental trauma. So as we start to connect with that in ourselves and structuralize, then we can start to meet these emotions and hold them in a different way,
Mhm.
right? Whereas a therapist, a lot of what I was taught was to get people into their emotions right away. Let's just get people, first of all, that's doing something and objectifying someone. So already right there, I'm not creating the conditions for working with complex developmental trauma. And then to push someone into something, if they're relating to that emotion from their child consciousness, it can be re-traumatizing. It might not be, it's not even therapeutic to do that in a sense. And so through the perspective of NARM, um, so as we learn to work with people to structuralize themselves, then when they can work with their anger or their sadness, it's experienced, I would say, from a very different place within ourselves.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what is, like, when you say work with people to structuralize themselves, like what does that look like? Or, it sounds really good. Like on a energetic level, I can imagine what that feels like. And yet maybe on a practical level, I'm not fully grasping it.
Hmm. Well, it can look a lot of different ways. I think one way it can look is one of the ways in which we work with people is to start to deconstruct an experience, and we start to explore. Um, well, actually, we could start at the beginning. So one of the ways we work in NARM is we never start exploring until we have what they call a Narma contract, which essentially is consent. And so the whole first part of the session is really clarifying what the client wants for themselves, and usually clarifying to a state, not a behavior. So if the client wants a deeper sense of peace within themselves, then the next question I'll have is, will it be okay to explore what's getting in the way of experiencing peace within yourself? And even in that process, we're starting to structuralize just by clarifying what they're wanting for themselves and why they're showing up. Because a lot of us, we may not even know why we're coming really to therapy. We might have an idea of why we're there. It's often usually to change a behavior, but there's often something under that. So as we start to clarify, that becomes structuralizing because there's a more awareness around why I'm here. And so that alone creates a kind of structure within our system. And then when we start to explore what's getting in the way of something, it's okay, well, I'm having a conversation with my partner and she says I didn't do the dishes, and then I feel or I'll it's often what we tell ourselves, I've done something wrong, and now that I've done something wrong, then I could be punished. And when we start to see this pattern that lays out, right? Though is that familiar? Yes, that pattern. We start to with structuralize by really, I'll often reflect it back. So whenever you are challenged for not doing the dishes, you start to tell yourself that you've done something wrong. And if we really slow that down, what happens when you tell yourself you've done something wrong to that connection with the sense of peace? Well, it cuts me off from that sense of peace. So now that's kind of a structural, and we start to see this unconscious behavior that is in the way we're relating to ourselves, more or less, playing out. And as we start to kind of bring that unconscious into the conscious, that can be structuralizing,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. So that's kind of a simple way to start to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hear in that too, this piece of agency in the contract that, uh, having therapy done to you, so to
Yeah.
speak, is maybe even could be a re-traumatizing experience, because at least my experience of complex developmental trauma is one of feeling somewhat powerless and without choice a
Yeah.
lot of times. And so it's like what I'm hearing is that it starts with like choosing
Mm-hmm.
to go in, becoming conscious of like what you want, and also having choice of going into it,
Yeah.
like choosing to look at it, and then once you're looking at it, choosing what to do from there.
Yeah.
That place of choice seems to open a different container, maybe.
Absolutely. Well, because as a child, we don't have that capacity. We don't have choice. We don't have agency. We don't have the capacity to say, oh, my dad had a bad day at work and that's why he's angry at me, or he needs to go to therapy, right? Or, we don't have, we're not able to say, well, at 5 years old, this isn't working out for me. I'm moving in down the street. We don't have that. So, of course, we're going to start to feel powerless, and we're going to feel like we can't, that things are being done to us, which is a form of objectification. And then when we start to objectify ourselves, like say as a child, well, then I'm going to pressure myself to, be a way that I gain a sense of acceptance. When I start to pressure myself, then that can lead through my life. And that's a form of objectifying myself, which is really something almost difficult to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we start to recognize from our adult consciousness, I've seen clients over and over again when I ask them, well, what's different now for you when you were a child? It's often around, I have choice now. And the way that can land in someone's system can be very powerful. Just acknowledging the fact that we have choice and that we aren't powerless in situations. Again, we're talking about a situation where people are relatively safe and they are in a place where they have, you know, somewhat of a capacity to be safe, and the environment. I mean, it's challenging because of their environmental failure in our society can often mimic what we experience as a child. But as an adult, we do have this capacity to connect with ourselves and live with dignity. My teacher often through the Narma Institute will say, even people who are incarcerated can connect with themselves in a relatively safe way within that environment, and live with dignity. Like Nelson Mandela, when he came out of being incarcerated for 30 some years, what was it within him that allowed him to come out and still be connected to himself, be connected to his heart, and be such a heartful change agent, right? There's something even in the most difficult experiences in which we can access and connect to something within ourselves, which is a very different feeling than powerlessness.
Yeah. I just got a question that came through here.
Okay,
Uh,
I'll
can
do my
more,
best
yeah, yeah. Can more,
without pressuring myself.
yeah. And I want to make sure that we move into the exercise here soon.
Okay.
But I think this is an important point of clarification. Can you say more about what it means to objectivize yourself? um, to be distant from yourself.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So I think on the simplest level, it is the difference between objectifying and subjectifying. And if we're objectifying something, it is something that is needing something to be done to, right? So if I am, for example, pressuring myself to make something happen here today in some way, to prove something or make this the best, you know, presentation you've had, Megan, then it's like, then, then even in pressure myself, it's like I am something that needs to be done to. I'm needing to drive myself to show up in a certain way, as opposed to connecting with what is actually true for me in this moment and what's happening within me. And how am I tending to what's going on within me so that I can be more present to what's in front of me?
Hmm.
Okay. So it's there's a subtleness to it. I've really found when I first heard this, well, this is a form of objectifying myself. It took me a long time to start to even grok, well, what do you mean I'm objectifying myself?
Hmm.
But it's very easy to do actually, and even as a therapist, if I'm seeing my client as someone that I need to fix, that is something that I'm needing to change or do something to. As opposed to if I can, and it's tricky with NARM, it's a beautiful dance. It's very client centered, but it's also very directive at the same time. But if I can start to show up with what is actually present right here between our relationship, our therapeutic relationship, connected to myself without pressuring myself to do anything, I'm completely amazed at how things open up within myself and within the person sitting in front of me.
Hmm.
Because now I'm meeting them the best of my ability, connected to my heart and connecting and attuning to what's happening within them in relationship to what they want and what's getting in the way of what they want. So I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, there's a lot of ways we could explore objectification, the way we're in relationship to the natural world, that it's a resource, that it's something we take from so that we can have resources to enrich our life, as opposed to a deeper conversation with the natural world around, starting to listen and experience the natural world through our bodies, our imagination, our senses, and being in a sacred reciprocity with the natural world.
Hmm.
I think Thich Nhat Hanh talks about inner being, that on some level that there is a deep connection between all of us, and really experiencing that as opposed to just cognitively knowing that is more of subjectivity versus objectivity.
Hmm.
So it comes back to most simply how we're relating to ourselves. Am I seeing myself as something that needs to be something done to, or am I really opening up to connecting with what's happening within me and being present with that?
Yeah, to me, I hear like a listening, whether it's like listening to the self, like making space to listen to what's authentic, true in the moment, and allowing that to emerge rather than kind of having this top down sort of mental idea of how things
Mhm.
should be and trying to get it to conform to that, whether that's
Mhm.
like with self, with the natural world, with another,
Mhm.
um, making space to really listen. And,
Yes.
you know, so we're getting to the time where I think we should move into the exercise just to have enough time, speaking of um, trying to create a form.
Yeah.
But I do want to make sure we leave space for that. One maybe concluding remark I want to touch on is with this topic of transforming your trauma. I I feel like it's really important to acknowledge that it takes time.
Yeah.
That it's not this like, oh, I had this transformational moment. Like working in plant medicine and psychedelic therapy now, with ketamine. Over years of being in different scenarios with those kind of peak experiences where maybe make contact with the adult consciousness and have this like completely new experience of relating to the world, or empower this experience that's been forgotten, this certain form of consciousness, and then a week later or a day later find yourself right back in the child consciousness. It's like I've seen in myself and so many other people this shaming cycle of like, I thought I'd changed and I haven't, or putting
Hmm.
this expectation
Yeah.
for the healing to happen in a certain amount of time. And I know I
Yeah.
heard you speak to this earlier. I just want to kind of highlight it, is that that metaphor you used of paving new tracks in the snow,
Yeah.
that it takes time and dedication and practice. And it's like, there is no amount of time that it takes. It's just the amount of time that it takes.
Exactly. Yeah. And isn't it interesting how we shame ourselves and then shame ourselves for shaming ourselves and then shaming ourselves for that pattern starts to play out. And then we have, it's like we're buried in this, right? In the way that we're relating to ourselves. And gosh, I was really good at that. I, find myself really good at that. And so starting to really see that and noticing that within ourselves, like that's comes out of for very good reasons, like we've talked about, that self-attack comes from a way that we were wired to survive in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does take time to start to connecting with our heart. So because if it was if it can be very dangerous for us to start to connect to my heart and my body, right? If I have had an experience as a young person where I disconnected as a way to survive, then I had this pattern going on for 30 years. And then I showed up in a therapy session and from like a somatic perspective, just started inviting someone into their body right away. I mean, that could be very scary for the person and very dangerous. So it takes time. It takes a long time before we can come. And then the pacing really involved is just like we're talking about. It's each individual person has their own pacing with it,
Yeah.
and honoring that,
Yeah.
and honoring that in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the ketamine work I do, the integration coaching, we talk about like the integration work is sort of like noticing when the first step is kind of noticing when the old way is emerging. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that takes a week to notice, maybe you
Yeah.
just like completely fall into this old pattern for a week. Maybe it's for 30 seconds,
Yeah.
but just noticing when you notice, like pulling back the energy from that pattern and feeding the new one.
Yeah.
And that's not always like,
Yeah.
usually there's something in the middle that has to happen for that switch. But sometimes it just starts with, like we started in the beginning, the noticing
Absolutely.
and reconnecting,
Yes.
reconnecting to the adult consciousness,
Yeah.
or maybe it's as simple as the heart. Um, okay, well, so I know I forgot to mention this at the beginning. I did say it in the email, but Joseph is gonna guide a process here, or at least part of one.
Mm-hmm.
Give us some insight into what I don't know, how would you name this process? How would you call this?
Well, I thought what I thought we might do is just start with that clarifying what we call in NARM, clarifying the contract, of just starting to get clear about what we're actually wanting for, what you're wanting for yourself, and getting clear about that. And and then maybe just in there, as opposed to then starting to explore what gets in the way. But we might just talk about then, because one of the things I was thinking about coming, having the listeners or the audience come away with today is to start thinking about what they're wanting for themselves. And then how are we relating to and organizing our internal experience around what we're relating, how we're for what we're wanting for ourselves. So just starting to think about getting curious about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, we're going to kind of dive into the process that Joseph's been sharing and at least start with it. And then, and And so what we came up with for how to do this is, I think Joseph's going to invite each of you to do this for yourself who's listening. And then I'm going to also serve as kind of like a demo client here, and be a switch from being a facilitator for a little bit to being a client, to just give an example of what this might look like, of really coming into contact with what you want, what I want, and see where that leads.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great because I actually haven't really I've done this one-on-one, so it's kind of an experiment today to see what it might be like to do with a group and start to explore this, and we'll see how it goes.
All right.
Okay. Well, you ready to dive into this, Megan? And
Sure. Yeah,
okay. Okay.
absolutely.
So, just curious here, what would you want for yourself out of this time together here today?
Well, um, I mean, on a meta level, I'm hoping that we're going to help the people listening connect to kind of like what they want, and what is, maybe, when I feel into what I want, it's usually something that I don't have
Hmm.
that's been, um, calling, that feels somehow, I think, in the context of this conversation, like I've been, I knew that you were going to ask me this question, and I was tuning into like what feels really essential to me on my path of bringing my medicine into the world. Like, what is it that I want most right now connected to that? And I'm sure I could give you a more esoteric answer, but I'm going to instead give you a really practical one and see where it takes us. um, I really want to have a home,
Hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and that's something that has, in a way, eluded me for a long time, and it feels like an important piece um, to opening more space for myself to come into the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm offering that up as an example, just to help us unpack what this looks like. But I'm also, you
Mm-hmm.
know, curious if, well, I'll just let you guide.
Well, yeah, because I'm curious here if you did have a home and you had more space to come into the world, what would you hope that that would give you or do for you?
I had, I mean, it feels like a lot of things when I imagine having a home.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a much more controlled environment, like that I have a space to rest when I want to rest.
Mm-hmm.
I have space to create when I want to create. And yeah, it just feels like there's more space for me.
Yeah. And if you had this controlled environment where you could rest and create, what would what would be different within you?
Hmm. I mean, I think what comes to me is just feeling more at ease.
Mm. Feeling more at ease.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how would it be to explore further together what's getting in the way of feeling more at ease?
Sure.
In-
Let's do it.
Okay. And there's be a lot of ways, right? So is it okay if we just pause for a second?
Yep.
on the
Absolutely.
process. Yeah,
Yep.
just acknowledge one that like, so that would be clarifying. Here's what I hear you're wanting for yourself is to get into to have more sense of at ease within yourself. Um, in relationship to bringing your medicine into the world and having a home, and so this would be where we would start exploring. And so I don't know if we have some time,
Yeah, we do. Can I add
and if you
something to
want to.
that too?
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
just for people listening. One of the things that in the coaching model that I've been trained in, which feels very resonant with this NAR model and the work that Joseph that you do, it's like starting with this thing that you kind of think you want, and then it's in the model I use. It's like the issue. It's like, what's the issue?
Hmm.
It's very logical in a way. And then, like, very quickly, what I'm noticing in the questions you asked me is that it's like it went from this thing out there to this thing in here
Mm,
within me,
yeah.
which, like, one of the ways that we call that is like the deeper need, or like
Hmm.
what is actually the underlying deeper thing that I'm wanting rather than the surface
Yes.
externalized thing. Like, what is at the root of that? What's
Yeah.
beneath that?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you talking and being open to talking about your inner experience, because there's a couple levels happening here, right? There's your process, which is real, that's unfolding here, and then your willingness to kind of talk about the the process that we're in together, right? Because I want to honor that, right, as well, that this isn't, that we're doing this in a way that honors your process and you as well in demoing this for the group of individuals. So thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'm good to go into ease.
And how much time do we have?
I think, well, we've got about 25 minutes here.
Okay.
And I so we probably have like another 15 minutes for this portion.
Hmm. Well, okay.
One, and we can also ask if there are any questions about this, you know, from the people listening.
Okay. Should we pause and see if there's any questions?
Yeah. I mean, do any of you have, well, I guess one curiosity I have is if those listening have taken a moment to connect with what they might want.
Yeah, and maybe we do that. Maybe we just take a moment and just if folks are open, just if it feels okay for you, you obviously have the choice to do this or not, but if it feels okay to start to get curious about what it is that you are wanting for yourself right now and in this moment.
And if you want to, you can share in the chat if it feels like something comfortable to share. And it can be the external thing. It doesn't have to be the internal thing unless you're aware of what that is.
And as maybe as you start to reflect on what you're wanting for yourself, maybe that comes right away, maybe it takes some time, but a follow-up question could be, if you did have that in your life, if you did have that, like, what would you hope that that would bring to you or bring to your life?
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to put these questions in the chat for everyone. So, what would you hope that would bring to your life?
Yeah, or bring within you, or it could be bring in your life, or bring with to you in some way.
And it seemed like you asked me that once, and then did you ask that again? Did you ask that kind of twice, or was there another follow on after that?
I think I asked you maybe some different versions of that.
Yeah, just kind of
Some
like
more
going
clarifying.
deeper with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And then, a third question might be is how is it for you to start asking yourself these questions around what do I want for myself? And if I had what I want for myself, what would that bring me?
Hmm.
Yeah. Or another follow-up there could be, if I had this, what would shift in me? And just get curious about if it's okay, how is it to start reflecting on asking yourself these questions?
I'm going to just read a few of the responses here so we can all hear them. So, one response: my experience of this process in this moment is the link between what I want, what this would do for me, and what difference would this make in me is the idea of gaining faith in myself to do what I am divinely made to do
Mm,
when being of service. Love that. Beautiful.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. And then another one is the ability to address difficult emotions in the midst of feeling them rather than repressing them or storming off.
Mm,
The desire to be authentic in expressing tough emotions that are true to me. What would it bring? True peace. Love it.
mhm. Yeah.
So, do we have time then? It's like once you connect with the deeper want, clarify the deeper want, like where do you go from there?
So once we have some consent, and this is really important through the lens of complex developmental trauma, because it actually will connect to that question earlier around objectification, right? This is why before in the NAR model, we always ask for consent, and the person can say no. They absolutely can say no. That no, and I've had that where a client says, nope, you know what? I don't want to explore that today with you. And that say, okay, great. Is there something else? And we will go into another track. So here, right, that you know, as you say yes, we got consent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because when we objectify something, we don't ask for consent, we just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Something to some. So here, this is creating those conditions now for exploration around exploring what's getting in the way of feeling at ease.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of choice points here. But if you're open, I'd be curious if there is an example, Megan, of a time where you have felt a sense of at ease within yourself.
Hmm. I mean, the most consistent example I can think of is being out in nature for extended periods of time.
Yeah.
And sometimes it takes a little bit, but even just when I start walking on a trail within a few minutes, typically I start to feel that drop in pretty quickly.
Mm,
Extended times kind of drops into a whole other level.
hmm.
But that's the first thing that comes to me.
And if it's okay, if we slow that down and almost like put that under a microscope,
Mm-hmm.
and what do you see happening in that moment, in that shift where you drop in and you start to feel that sense of at ease? Like what's happening there within yourself?
I mean, it feels like there's a bit of a, like in my body, just like a letdown, like an
Yeah.
exhale of sorts. Feels like my energy drops out of
Mm-hmm.
my head and more into my body,
Mm-hmm.
even like lower in my body, like more into my belly, um, even into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I also feel like my awareness shifts, like what I'm taking in
Mm-hmm.
kind of goes from like maybe a little over focused to much more expansive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as you step into nature, you start to connect in, with what's happening in your body and your perception or awareness, I think was the word you used. expands. And again, if we even slow that down a little more, what is it that you are then connecting, or let me ask it this way, in when that happens, what do you see about within you the relationship to feeling at ease?
Can you ask that again?
So as you step into nature and start to feel this within your body and your awareness expands, what is it that you are connecting with in you that's
Hmm.
supporting that at ease?
Hmm. It, from a more abstracted, I mean, my answer is
Hmm.
more like my higher self, which feels much, in a way, beyond my body, like
Hmm.
much extending much further beyond my body.
Mm.
Um, Even though I'm connecting to my body, it feels like it's taking me into a much more expansive state that
Hmm.
goes far beyond my body and is much more chill.
Yeah, 'cause I'm curious what your higher self is. Like, what do you mean by your higher self?
um, it's sort of more like peaceful, observant aspect of myself that can see the bigger context, that can witness myself and the rest of the world, and uh, in this way where there's like nothing's wrong.
Hmm.
So, does that make sense? There's nothing to fix, there's nothing to change, it just is.
So in this moment, when your higher self starts to tell you, or you start to say to yourself from this place within you that there's nothing wrong, there's nothing to fix, then what happens to that connection with at ease?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, they seem to go hand in hand. Like
Yeah.
it's like there's more ease instantly of just like, oh, I don't need to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of see you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just curious how it is for you to start to together here identify or name that when you are in your higher self and you start to speak in that way or tell yourself that there's nothing to fix, there's nothing wrong, that it brings you into that sense of at ease. How is that to start to identify together?
Now, it seems like a potential shortcut. I don't know if I'm answering the question that you asked, but it feels like, yeah, it's like there's a connection there.
Oh. What's the connection for you?
Well, just saying there's nothing wrong, there's nothing to fix. Like when I think about that with my house, for example, or my lack of home
Yeah.
and current life in that pattern, so to speak, is like just there's nothing to fix, there's nothing wrong. Brings me into a sense of peace around not currently having the thing that I think I need to be okay, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That again here is you, I think you're really naming this. It seems like a kind of pattern that when you tell yourself there's nothing to fix, there's nothing wrong, that it brings you closer to that sense of at ease.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say that even here now, like what do you notice happen within you?
Well, it helps me let go and let down around any sense of trying to like control my current circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. How's that for you to name that? that it helps you actually let go of control.
Hmm. Yeah, it's good. It's a good awareness
Yeah.
and reminder, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, what do you mean good for you?
Well, it it just helps me. um what do I mean good for me?
Yeah, like what's good about it as you
Yeah.
name that? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like an awareness that I think I am, like, my sort of, if I think of it in the context of my child consciousness or my pattern in life, um, maybe there's been a hypervigilance in me of
Hmm.
uh, a pattern of like constantly finding the next thing I need to fix to be okay,
Yeah.
or trying to control my environment to feel safe.
Yeah.
And it's just a reminder of like, oh, like I'm falling into that again. Like, actually, everything's okay. There's
Yeah.
nothing to fix. It's all unfolding in perfect time.
Yeah.
It just helps me kind of catch that. And for me, I think so much of my home, like, there's been a lot of trauma that's revolved around my experience of home in my life. And
Hmm.
so it's like catching that, oh, like my thoughts about home, all of that is
Hmm.
like, has been sort of tied up in the past, and
Hmm.
just gives it space to be like, I can have the same feeling about this that I have about everything else.
Yeah.
Like, I can choose that.
Yeah.
I
Is it okay if I reflect something back to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm hearing here is what you're really wanting for yourself is a sense of at ease. And here, what I heard you say is that when you start to connect with your higher self and tell yourself that there's nothing, everything's okay, I don't need to fix anything or change anything, it actually creates that sense of at ease from within you. As opposed to what I think I'm hearing you say, that kind of like control around you, right? To control what's around you, where this is actually coming from within you. This sense of ease actually comes from within you.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of what you said about Nelson Mandela, where it's like, even in any, in prison, that like in this example, I can have that experience within myself, regardless of the external. Like, I don't need a
Wow.
home to feel at ease.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think is that okay if I mean, I'm kind of struck by that. I don't know. That seems important to name. Like, how is that for you to start to acknowledge that you have this within you and different than having a home. Like, here it is within you. Even if you don't have a home, you can feel it at ease.
Hmm. Yeah, it feels like a form of, like, taking my power back in a way.
Oh,
Like, oh, because I mean, ultimately, like, things can always change.
yeah.
It's possible to have a home and then it disappears
Yeah.
the next day.
Yeah. Because the truth is, it's challenging out there right now, and it may be difficult to find a home, and it may take some time. Like, that's kind of the truth around it all. And what I'm hearing though, that you're taking your power back in a way that you can create that sense of what you're wanting for yourself from within, even if you don't have a home.
Right. It's not putting it out there on a home for me to be able to feel at ease,
Yeah.
giving my power away to this elusive home.
Yeah. Well, just curious how that's landing in you to even have me reflect that back and
It's
hear that
good.
within yourself.
It feels very, like, freeing a bit, like I can hold the home thing a little looser.
Yeah.
It comes when it comes. These things come and go. It
Yeah.
doesn't, like, control me. or my life.
Wow. Yeah. And it's freeing. Is there a connection or relationship with that sense of that freeingness and being at ease?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like letting go of what's out there, you know,
Yeah.
the the freedom that comes from like not trying to control what's out of my realm of control.
Yeah.
And just, yeah, that brings more ease actually in a lot of ways.
Ah, maybe again, just creating a little space for that together here. And I don't know how we're doing on time either. But
I think we probably should maybe
yeah.
wrap up there, and just maybe if you might share a little bit about like what was behind that process that you're guiding, kind of like this next piece of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky because I'd be talking about your experience. So I just want to,
I'm okay with that.
yeah, is that okay if we,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Um, Curiosity. I mean, it's like as a child, one thing we really didn't get in general, often in our society, is someone being really curious about what's happening for us, like starting to create the conditions for what is going on here. And I was curious about like what in you actually supports being at ease.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of choice points there we could have gone down, if we had more time. And it was we were,
Right.
yeah, we had a lot of choice points, but um, just really curious about your capacity and your agency around actually stepping into what you're really wanting for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and how you do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things I noticed right away is like, I think in the trauma training that I've gone through, one of the things we talked about is resourcing. It's like creating a reference point of where we've already experienced that thing that we're
Hmm.
wanting. So, like in the shares, having faith in myself, or
Hmm.
coming into authentic expression of tough emotions, or true peace, or with me, ease. Like, when have I already experienced that? So,
Yeah.
it's like opening to that adult consciousness first in a completely different container
Hmm.
than the situation where it's currently very difficult to access, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Good.
well, what I was observing is that through coming into contact with that within myself, and you helping me explore it, and then coming back into relationship with the issue, it was like, of the home, it's like relating to it from a completely different consciousness, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you so beautifully did that, right? Not everyone might uh, do that. you, and and you so beautifully did that. And another choice point could be is to get curious together eh, about what's the difference between when you are connecting with that sense of at ease and how you're relating to yourself, and in times that you're not feeling connected to that, or feeling, or whatever comes up in those moments, like what's happening in the way you're relating to and organizing your experience in those moments, and start to look at and explore the difference
Mm-hmm.
around that is a way to explore more around the agency piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
beautiful.
I'm saying that as a way also just to offer that to the group of,
Yep.
if that resonated, like what are the difference between those times and the way that we are in relationship to ourselves when we are getting closer to what we want, and then when we're feeling farther away from it? What is the difference between how we are showing up with ourselves in those moments?
Mm-hmm. And then, not that we're going to continue to going, but is there like, where would you go from here at a high level? Is or
Oh,
is that something you can answer? Like, if you were to continue guiding this process with me
oh,
or with
yeah.
another client, like
Yeah.
Where do you go?
Well, there's lots of different ways, and just, it might be collaborative. We could even, I might get curious with you of which way feels most congruent to go, but that would be one way, is to start to explore the difference between those two experiences. Um, there was this piece that came in around control, and I was very curious of like, well, what has been right about that for you?
Hmm.
What has been right about the control? How has it served you? That could have been a way to go and get curious about.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it could be exploring yeah.
It's kind of an organic process of like unpacking what shows up as it emerges, or
Yeah.
meeting what shows up and being curious with it. And
Yeah. It's very different than like showing up with someone again, like, I need to do something. Like, here are the steps we're going to go through so that we can get to A, B, and C, or do what. Yeah. Here, I'm just really doing my best to be connected with myself and really getting curious with you about, again, what you're wanting for yourself and what's getting in the way of what you're wanting for yourself. And
mhm,
maybe what brings you closer to what you're wanting for yourself.
mhm.
Yeah.
And I think learning like this process is something that can be really supportive on an individual basis of sort of self-healing work, of
Hmm.
at least the clarification of like exploring what it is you're wanting, and what's really beneath that, what's the deeper longing, so to speak. And then certainly there's uh, I've experienced in myself, kind of guiding myself through these things usually leads to something fruitful.
Hmm.
And I also, just in having another person present like highlighting certain things, I do, even just you, like an unexpected thing is that I didn't expect this to lead to a theme around control and trying to control my environment.
Exactly.
Right. And I
Yeah.
don't know that I would have completely landed there on my own. Um, and so yeah, I just want to acknowledge that it's like part of the intent with this time together today was to like look at the landscape of transforming trauma, and um, create a process that might support each one of us on our own. And also, I really want to acknowledge the value of, like, oftentimes having a guide present can take it much deeper.
Mm.
And I think you said this to me. Someone said this to me. It was like, healing happens in community.
Mm.
Healing happens through relationship.
Yeah.
And so there is some power too in being met by another
Hmm.
around these spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, there was a big shift in that coming into NARM. The relational piece of the process has been deeply supportive and healing for me in my own work around it.
Yeah.
I really believe in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for
Yeah. Thank you,
sharing
Megan.
with us. And we've had a couple questions. I just want to see is there any last questions before we wrap up here? If anyone is thinking of, I'm also going to put, if any of you are interested, Joseph has a website. I'll send this out with the recording in the email too. Um, but you can check out Joseph's work here. Is there anything you want to say about your work, what you're currently doing, or how you might be able to show up if someone wants to get in touch?
Yeah, just if they're on my website, there's my email and phone number if you want to call. And I often set up half-hour consultations to chat about, what the you're wanting, and if what I offer, and if it feels like it aligns. And I'm always happy to do that. Um, and you can get all that information on that seedandstone.org.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't see any questions coming through. So I guess we'll consider that complete.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
we would love your feedback. If anyone live or listening back, please let us know about your experience today, and what you've received from it. And we will be doing this again next month, June 23rd, with my friend and colleague, Kim Coots. There'll be more information on the theme coming out very soon. So lots of love and see you next time.
Thank you.